I'm joined once again by Richard Wolff. He is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, also a visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. Professor Wolff, last time you were on, we talked about whether terms like capitalist and socialist were relevant when applied broadly to American economic policy. And to kind of shorten that interview into one sentence, we determined they weren't particularly relevant in having meaningful discussions about modern economics in the US. We recently talked about an article which outlined that Sweden, in spite of the maybe superficial assumption that it is socialistic or communistic in terms of the amount of social programs that are provided, business regulation, etc., has still managed to have more billionaires per capita than the US. Now, I made clear when I talked about that in my mind, billionaires per capita are not the barometer by which an economy should be judged. But putting that aside, very often we hear from the American right that economies like Sweden simply do not allow for such accumulation of wealth, particularly with social programs like healthcare for all. Let's start there. Is there anything specific about social programs that prevents vast wealth from accumulating?
Basically, no, because the question is really what the connection might be between providing a social safety net or social welfare on the one hand and individual wealth. It is possible that a society could decide that the way to pay for social welfare and so on is to tax people who are very wealthy and make that the source of the money needed to provide a safety net. In that situation, and by the way, no major society has done that, but it's possible to do it in that way and use the money from the wealthy. You know, the person who came closest to that in modern history, may surprise you, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1943 and 1944, when he proposed in his State of the Union message and sent to Congress an income tax rate of at the highest level for the richest Americans of 100%. What that meant was, in those years, every dollar over $25,000, which would be roughly $375,000 today, but anyone who earned over $25,000, President Roosevelt said, should be taxed at 100%. In other words, they couldn't earn more than $25,000, no matter what their technical salary or payments might have been. And that was a very serious proposition of a president. The Republicans went predictably ballistic when it was delivered to the Congress. But when all the hoopla and posturing was over, the Republicans and Democrats agreed to a top income tax bracket in the United States in those years of 94%.
Right.
So that would be a way of taxing the rich to provide, among other things, social welfare. But most societies haven't done that. They have provided social welfare by taxing all the different parts of society, and that has enabled people to become millionaires and billionaires in Sweden, for that matter today, in China, in France, in Germany, and so on.
There's kind of another layer to this discussion about social programs and the effect on the economy, which is we can look at kind of the more micro level, which is individually, food stamp dollars are highly stimulative relative to a tax cut for the rich. That's one area that we've talked about a lot. But I'm curious whether you think there's another level, which is if you have strong social programs, like in Sweden, for example, there are very strong social programs. If you are simply poor, not only do you have access to health care, but you actually have a sort of subsidy or stipend. The idea is that nobody be too low on the socioeconomic ladder, so to speak. Does that, at the macro level, actually help the large or medium businesses because the entire population has slightly more means with which to partake in their product or service? Can we look at that approach?
Yes, I think you should even take it further. Excuse me. If a firm hires people who have a national health service that firm does not have to do the immense record keeping, premium paying, personnel hiring to manage the medical benefits, as we call them here, for these individuals, because the government basically does that. And if they use a single payer type of system, the savings are astronomical. We spend in this society roughly 18% of our GDP on medical care. No other society comes anywhere near that. Every other advanced industrial society pays half or less of that and gets better medical outcomes than we have here in the United States. So it is a perfect example of how providing quality care to the people, the mass of the people, is directly beneficial to businesses, even separate from the fact that they might have more money to spend on the products of those goods. In order to believe in the American system, which tends to cast aspersions on government intervention, you have to believe something remarkable, which is that every other advanced industrial country, every European country, our neighbors to the north, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many, many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have all opted for a social safety net, unlike the United States. Now, either all of them are mistaken and all of them are misguided and all of them have had some strange results, or else we're the strange ones, we're the outlying observation, and I think the odds are and the logic is more towards the latter than the former.
Oftentimes, when I have individual conversations like this with some of the right-wingers on this program, we'll start with, for example, okay, let's look at how well the stock market has done under President Obama. Often something they present as an indicator of how well the economy is doing. However, when I mention that, all of a sudden, that's not the right barometer. When we look at millionaires and billionaires, all of a sudden that becomes not the right barometer when talking about Sweden. When we talk about the middle class, all of a sudden all of the countries you mentioned are not the right barometer. This seems to me kind of like an obvious ad hoc moving of the goalposts, so to speak, that quite frankly doesn't really make any sense. Where do you think that this moving of the goalposts comes from?
I think this moving of the goalpost or switching the barometer is a kind of defensiveness of those who want to point to an American capitalism with the kind of pride and confidence they once had, but is now fast eluding them. I mean, we have to face a reality which they're confronted with. This capitalism crashed in December of 2007, and it hasn't recovered in any way except for the super rich in the last 6 years. The vast majority of Americans are confronted every day with the rising debts they have to incur to get their kids through college, with the prospects of poor jobs and poor incomes for most of the people that graduate these days, for insecure jobs, for jobs with fewer, if any, benefits, for a government that is toying with cutting back on the Social Security at the same time that the private sector job situation is grim. To defend capitalism has become much, much harder. And so I think you're seeing the kind of shuck and jive, the dodging, the trying to hold on to some metric that can be pointed to continue to defend a system that is becoming more and more difficult to defend. And I think those are the kinds of tactics. On one point about billionaires, just to make it more amusing, but it's all true, the biggest surge in billionaires is not Sweden or even Europe. The biggest surge in billionaires is the People's Republic of China. More billionaires have been created there in the last 3 years than anywhere in the world, with the possible exception of the United States. And even if the United States is ahead, the Chinese are now neck and neck. I'm not sure what you would conclude from this, but since that is a society run by the Communist Party, and that is a society that uses Marx and Lenin and all that as justifications and inspirations, it would seem that your social philosophy, economically speaking, need have no necessary relationship to the billionaires you do or do not generate.
All right, Professor Richard Wolff, visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. Pleasure as always to speak with you.
Thank you, David. I appreciate your interest.